In the winter of 1998, a university archivist named Robert Chen was cataloging abandoned medical records from a demolished psychiatric facility in rural Illinois. Among boxes of patient files dating back to the 1870s, he found something that would change everything he thought he knew about the capacity for evil in children. It was a leather-bound journal, water-stained and brittle with age. The name embossed on the cover had faded to barely visible letters. Dr. Isaac Walcott, physician, 1872-1879. Most of the entries documented routine cases: melancholia, hysteria, moral insanity, the diagnoses of an era struggling to understand the human mind. But near the back of the journal, Chen found a section marked in darker ink, underlined with such force that the pen had torn through the yellowed paper. The heading read, "Special Cases, Juvenile Patients." One name appeared again and again, each mention more desperate than the last: Sarah Ann Miller. Dr. Isaac Walcott was no stranger to disturbed children. By 1874, when Sarah Ann Miller arrived at the Riverside Asylum for the insane and feeble-minded, he had spent 6 years treating juvenile patients suffering from epilepsy, religious mania, and what Victorian medicine called constitutional weakness of character. His training at the Philadelphia College of Physicians had exposed him to the worst cases of childhood madness that 19th century America could produce. But nothing had prepared him for Sarah. The first journal entry about her was dated April 3, 1874. Walcott wrote that the county overseer had delivered a new ward to the children's facility that morning. A girl, approximately 10 years of age, sole survivor of the Miller family fire that had claimed 4 lives the previous month in the town of Moorfield. She arrived wearing a clean pinafore dress, her blonde hair neatly braided, looking like any other orphaned child seeking refuge. Walcott described his initial examination of the girl. She answered his questions politely, maintained appropriate posture, and showed none of the typical signs of trauma he would expect from a child who had watched her family burn to death. When asked about the fire, she recited her account with the practiced precision of someone who had told the story many times. She had awakened to smoke, tried to wake her parents, but the flames had spread too quickly. She escaped through her bedroom window while the rest of her family perished. The doctor noted something that disturbed him deeply. During the entire examination, while describing the deaths of her parents and siblings, Sarah's expression never wavered. Her pale blue eyes held the studied blankness of a porcelain doll, beautiful, perfectly formed, and completely lifeless. Walcott wrote that he had seen similar emptiness only once before, in the eyes of shell-shocked soldiers during the war, men whose minds had been broken by too much death. But Sarah had not been broken by trauma. She had simply been born without whatever essential element made humans capable of feeling for others. That first night, Walcott found himself unable to sleep. He kept seeing those eyes in the darkness of his quarters, watching him with that same clinical detachment. The official county record stated that Sarah had been found wandering along the main road outside Moorfield on the night of March 17, 1874. The Miller family farmhouse had burned to the ground, killing both parents and 2 younger siblings. The local sheriff had questioned Sarah and noted her unusual composure, describing her as remarkably calm for a child who had just lost everything. What the sheriff had not noted, but what Walcott would later discover by requesting the full county investigation file, was a series of troubling details about the fire itself. The blaze had started in multiple locations simultaneously, suggesting deliberate arson rather than accident. Sarah's bedroom window showed no signs of soot or smoke damage, as if it had been opened long before the flames began. And most disturbing of all, the bodies of Sarah's younger siblings had been found with their bedroom door blocked from the outside by a heavy chest of drawers. The county had ruled the fire accidental, largely because the alternative was unthinkable. Victorian America had no framework for understanding a child who could murder her own family. Walcott wrote in his journal, "If my suspicions are correct, then Sarah did not simply survive that fire. She orchestrated it with the careful planning of a military strategist. And she was 9 years old." Sarah adapted to life in the asylum's children's ward with unsettling ease. While other new arrivals wept for their lost families or cowered from the older, more violent patients, she moved through the halls with quiet confidence. Within days, Matron Hewitt was praising Sarah as the most helpful child the facility had seen in years. The girl assisted with younger children at mealtimes, read Bible passages aloud during evening devotions with perfect pronunciation, and never complained about even the most unpleasant chores. Walcott wrote that Sarah's exemplary behavior should have comforted him. Instead, it made him watch her more closely. He began timing his rounds to coincide with moments when Sarah thought she was unobserved. What he witnessed troubled him profoundly. He observed her reciting the 23rd Psalm to a group of younger children one evening, her delivery flawless and her voice gentle. But when she thought no one was watching, her face became a mask. No warmth, no compassion, just the cold observation of a naturalist studying insects under glass. She was not comforting the frightened children. She was cataloging their responses, learning which words produced tears and which produced trust. When one of the younger boys began to cry during the prayer, Sarah placed her hand on his shoulder and leaned close to whisper something in his ear. The boy immediately stopped crying and stared at her with unmistakable terror. Walcott questioned the child later about what Sarah had said, but the boy refused to answer. His hands trembled violently whenever the doctor mentioned her name, and that night he wet his bed for the first time in months. Walcott's journal entry from that evening revealed his growing fear. I am beginning to understand that Sarah's perfect behavior is not recovery from trauma or natural resilience. It is camouflage. She has learned to mimic human emotion with the same precision that a mockingbird mimics other bird songs. But there is nothing beneath the performance. Nothing at all. The first accident occurred 3 weeks after Sarah's arrival, and it shattered any remaining doubts Walcott harbored about the girl's true nature. Thomas Whitmore, a 7-year-old boy with a mild intellectual disability, fell from the third-floor staircase and suffered a broken arm along with severe bruising to his back and shoulders. The child claimed he had been pushed, but there were no witnesses to confirm his account. The staff dismissed his story as the confusion of a frightened, simple-minded boy. Sarah had been the first to raise the alarm, running to fetch Matron Hewitt while tears streamed down her face. She cried that poor Tommy had fallen and needed help immediately. But when Walcott examined the staircase later that afternoon, he found something that made his blood run cold. Small, bare footprints marked the dust near the top landing, positioned directly behind where Thomas would have been standing before his fall. Asylum regulations required all children to wear shoes indoors, and Sarah had been wearing her regulation boots when she reported the accident. Yet Walcott had seen her walking barefoot in the courtyard on multiple occasions, her small feet making the same distinctive prints he now observed at the scene of Thomas's fall. The doctor questioned Sarah about what she had witnessed. She met his gaze without flinching, those eyes like looking into a frozen pond, beautiful and utterly devoid of warmth, and explained that she had been in the washroom when she heard Thomas scream. Her story was plausible, her manner appropriately concerned. She even asked if poor Tommy would recover, her voice trembling with what sounded like genuine worry. But Walcott noticed a detail that Sarah had overlooked in her performance. When she clasped her hands together in apparent distress, there was a fresh scrape across her right palm, exactly the kind of mark one might get from gripping the staircase railing while leaning over to push someone. That night, Walcott wrote, "Every instinct I possess tells me she is lying. The problem is that instinct is not evidence. And without evidence, I am simply a physician who suspects a 10-year-old orphan of attempted murder. Who would believe me? More importantly, who would act on such an accusation?" He began sleeping even less, haunted by the thought of what Sarah might do next. 2 weeks later, 5-year-old Mary Brennan ingested laudanum from the asylum's medicine stores during the night. The child died the following morning without regaining consciousness, her small face peaceful in death, her lips stained with the telltale residue of the opiate. Walcott's journal entry about the incident was filled with self-recrimination. The medicine cabinet should have been locked, but in the chaos of managing 43 children and a dozen adult patients with only 2 attendants, security had grown dangerously lax. The key often hung on a nail beside the cabinet itself, visible to anyone who passed through the hallway. What the doctor noted with growing dread was Sarah's involvement in the days leading up to Mary's death. The girl had been assisting Walcott during his evening medical rounds for the past week, showing unusual interest in the various medicines he administered. She asked sophisticated questions about dosages and the effects of different substances, questions that seemed far too advanced for a 10-year-old with no medical training. Walcott recalled one particular conversation that now haunted him. When he had explained that even small amounts of laudanum could prove fatal to a young child, Sarah had tilted her head thoughtfully, the gesture of a student absorbing a particularly interesting lesson, and observed that it must be very dangerous to keep such things where children could reach them. She had smiled when she said it, a small, knowing smile that Walcott now realized was the expression of someone planning their next experiment. After Mary Brennan's death, Sarah volunteered to help Matron Hewitt prepare the small body for burial. She showed no distress at the sight of death, no sadness for a child she had lived alongside for weeks. Through the partially open door of the preparation room, Walcott observed Sarah studying Mary's face with the absorbed concentration of a medical student at an anatomy lecture. She tilted the dead child's head to examine the color of her lips, pressed her small fingers against Mary's neck as if checking for a pulse she knew would not be there, and traced the blue veins visible beneath the pale skin. The doctor's journal entry concluded with a line that would be circled and underlined in his later writings. She was not mourning, she was taking notes, and I realize now with terrible certainty that Mary Brennan was not an accident. She was a test. Sarah wanted to see if her theoretical knowledge about laudanum dosage would produce the expected results. It did, and now she knows. As May turned to June, Walcott's observations grew more disturbed, and his journal entries took on a tone of desperation. The asylum's groundskeeper began finding dead animals on the property, rabbits, chickens, and a young cat from the kitchen, all killed in the same peculiar manner. Their necks were broken cleanly at precisely the same point on the cervical spine, with no signs of predator attack, no scattered fur, no evidence of struggle. The kills were too precise, too consistent, too clinical. This was not the work of a fox or wild dog. This was the work of hands that understood anatomy and were practicing technique. Sarah was invariably the first to discover these dead animals. She would bring them to the kitchen door, neatly arranged on pieces of burlap, and offer to help bury them properly so they could return to God's earth. Her dress was always spotless, her hands always clean. But Walcott began documenting small details that Sarah could not completely erase. A fresh abrasion on her thumb consistent with gripping a struggling animal, a faint smear of blood beneath one fingernail that she had almost, but not quite, scrubbed away completely, a small tear in her sleeve that matched the scratch pattern of a rabbit's claws. Over 2 weeks, 11 more animals died on the asylum grounds. The groundskeeper remained convinced it was a fox that had learned to kill efficiently. The other staff members accepted this explanation gratefully. It was far more comfortable than any alternative. But Walcott could no longer deny what his reason told him was impossible. A 10-year-old girl was conducting systematic experiments in killing, refining her methods with each new subject. The final entry in this section of the journal described the moment when Walcott's suspicions became absolute certainty, the moment when he could no longer pretend he was simply a paranoid physician seeing evil where there was only childhood trauma. He had discovered Sarah in an old storage shed behind the main building, bent over something on the ground, completely absorbed in her work. The afternoon sun slanted through gaps in the wooden walls, illuminating her in bands of golden light. From a distance, she looked like an angel, a small, innocent child at play. When he approached, she turned to face him with no hint of surprise, no flash of guilt. At her feet lay a chicken, its neck twisted at an unnatural angle, its body still warm, its wings still twitching in the final involuntary reflexes of death. Sarah's hands were positioned on the bird's chest, and Walcott realized she had been counting the heartbeats. Her expression showed neither guilt nor fear, only mild annoyance at being interrupted during important work. She explained with the calm professionalism of a fellow physician discussing research findings that she had been checking to see how long it takes. After the neck breaks, she told him, the heart still beats for almost 2 minutes. She asked if the doctor had known that fact. Her tone suggested she would be disappointed if he did not. Walcott did know that. He was a physician trained in anatomy and the mechanics of death. He had learned it from textbooks and cadavers during his medical education. But Sarah Ann Miller was 10 years old, and she was teaching herself the same knowledge through direct methodical experimentation on living creatures. The doctor closed that day's journal entry with a question that revealed his deepest fear, the nightmare that kept him pacing his quarters until dawn. If she is practicing on animals now, perfecting her techniques with each kill, how long before she decides she has learned everything they can teach her? And when that moment comes, when chickens and rabbits no longer satisfy her curiosity, what will her next subjects be? Then, in handwriting that became increasingly erratic, he added a final line. Or perhaps she has already made that decision. Perhaps Mary Brennan and Thomas Whitmore were not accidents or opportunistic impulses. Perhaps they were the first human trials, and I am the only one who sees it. Beneath this entry, written in the margins weeks later in different, darker ink, Walcott had scrawled a single word that Chen would find circled again and again in the remaining pages of the journal. Run. Chapter 2. The Experimenter Without a Soul. Dr. Walcott's journal entries from June through August of 1874 reveal a man descending into a private hell. He could not prove what he knew to be true, and he could not ignore what he had witnessed. Sarah Ann Miller was not simply a disturbed child acting out trauma. She was something far more dangerous, a mind that functioned without the constraints of conscience, guilt, or empathy wrapped in the innocent exterior of a 10-year-old girl. The doctor began what he called his quiet investigation, a phrase that appeared repeatedly in his journal alongside increasingly desperate observations. He could not openly accuse Sarah without evidence that would convince the asylum's administrators, the county authorities, and a society that believed children were fundamentally innocent. So instead, he watched, he documented, and he tried to convince himself that he might still be wrong. Walcott's first systematic observation came on June 28, 1874. He had begun conducting what he described as moral examinations of the asylum's children, simple tests designed to assess their understanding of right and wrong, guilt and innocence. He framed these sessions as part of his medical duties, ensuring that each child's mental and spiritual health was properly monitored. Most children responded predictably. When asked about punishment, they showed fear. When asked about harming others, they expressed revulsion or sadness. When confronted with hypothetical moral dilemmas, they struggled visibly with the weight of choosing between two difficult options. Even the children suffering from severe intellectual disabilities or religious mania showed some emotional response to questions of right and wrong. Sarah's responses were entirely different. Walcott described one particular session in meticulous detail. He had asked Sarah what she thought about children who hurt other children. She sat perfectly still in the wooden chair across from his desk, her small hands folded in her lap, her pinafore dress pressed and clean. She considered the question for exactly 7 seconds. He counted, before responding. She said that such children were probably curious about cause and effect. Her voice was soft, thoughtful, as if she were discussing a mathematics problem. She explained that if you push someone, they fall. If you give someone the wrong medicine, they become sick. These were simply observations about how the world worked, no different from noting that rain makes puddles or that fire produces heat. There was no moral judgment in her voice, no recognition that causing harm was fundamentally different from observing natural phenomena. When Walcott pressed further, asking if she believed it was wrong to hurt others, Sarah paused again. This time she brought one finger to her lips, a gesture he had seen her use before when she knew adults were watching, a performance of thoughtful innocence. Then she said that the Bible taught that hurting others was sinful, and that she believed in the teachings of Scripture. She even quoted Matthew 7:12. Therefore all things whatsoever ye would that men should do to you, do ye even so to them. It was a perfect answer, delivered with appropriate solemnity, her eyes downcast as if in prayer. But Walcott noticed something that made his hands go cold. She had not said she believed hurting others was wrong. She had simply reported what the Bible taught, as if reciting a fact about geography or the declension of Latin verbs. The distinction was subtle, but it was everything. That night, he wrote in his journal, Sarah understands morality the way I understand Chinese characters. She can recognize the symbols, even reproduce them accurately when required, but she does not comprehend their meaning. She has learned that certain behaviors produce certain responses from adults. Praise for kindness, punishment for cruelty, and she modulates her actions accordingly. But there is no internal compass guiding her. Only calculation. Only cold arithmetic of consequence. He wanted desperately to be wrong. He lay awake that night trying to convince himself that he was seeing pathology, where there was only a bright, traumatized child learning to navigate a difficult world. But he could not shake the image of Sarah's eyes when she had quoted Scripture. Flat, empty, as if she were reading words written in a language she did not speak. In early July, Walcott's careful observation was shattered by an incident that forced him to confront what he had been trying to deny. It was a Tuesday afternoon, oppressively hot, the kind of Missouri summer day when the air felt thick enough to chew. The children had been granted outdoor recreation time in the asylum's courtyard, and Walcott was making his rounds when he heard a child screaming. He found 6-year-old Emma Crawford sitting in the grass, her right foot bleeding profusely. Other children clustered around her, some crying in sympathy, others staring with the morbid fascination that children often show toward injury. Sarah stood slightly apart from the group, her face arranged in an expression of appropriate concern, one hand pressed to her mouth in apparent shock. Matron Hewitt was already kneeling beside Emma, trying to calm the sobbing child. She explained to Walcott that Emma had stepped on something sharp, probably a rusty nail or a piece of broken glass hidden in the grass. It was the kind of accident that happened occasionally at the asylum, where maintenance was perpetually inadequate and the grounds held countless hazards. Walcott examined the wound carefully. It was a deep puncture in the soft arch of Emma's foot, bleeding freely. But something about it troubled him immediately. The wound was too clean, too precisely placed, and when he looked more closely, he could see dark material pressed deep into the tissue. Not just rust, but what appeared to be soil and fragments of organic matter deliberately embedded in the injury. He cleaned and bandaged the foot, gave Emma a small dose of laudanum for the pain, and sent her to the infirmary to rest. Then he went back to the spot where she had been injured and began searching the grass methodically, his hands sweeping through the blades in careful passes. He found it half buried in the soil, a long, thick nail, its point thrust upward through a flat piece of wood that had been concealed just beneath the grass. But the nail's point had been wrapped in cloth soaked with what smelled like manure and rotting vegetation, materials that would guarantee infection if they entered a wound. This was not a random hazard. This was a trap, carefully constructed and deliberately placed. Walcott stood there in the hot sun, the weapon in his hands, and felt his last hopes of being wrong crumble to dust. Someone had made this. Someone had buried it in a spot where children played. Someone had contaminated it to ensure maximum harm. He turned to look at the children still gathered near the courtyard entrance. Most had already forgotten the incident and returned to their games. But Sarah was watching him. She stood perfectly still in the shade of the building, her pale blue eyes fixed on his face with the focused attention of a naturalist observing an experiment in progress. When their gazes met, she did not look away, did not show guilt or fear. She simply watched to see what he would do. Walcott wrapped the nail in his handkerchief and returned to his office. He sat at his desk for an hour, staring at the weapon, trying to construct alternative explanations. Perhaps some groundskeeper had left it there accidentally. Perhaps the contamination was coincidental, just debris that had collected on the nail over time. Perhaps Emma had simply been unlucky. But he could not make himself believe any of these explanations. He knew what he was looking at. He knew who had made it. And he knew, with sickening certainty, that Emma Crawford's injury was not an isolated incident, but a test. A controlled experiment to see if Sarah could cause harm through indirect means and observe the results without being implicated. 3 days later, Emma developed a severe infection. Despite Walcott's best efforts with hot compresses and careful cleaning, the wound began to suppurate, the flesh around it turning angry red and swelling grotesquely. The girl developed a fever that spiked so high she became delirious, crying out for her dead mother in the darkness of the infirmary. Sarah visited Emma twice during her illness. She brought flowers she claimed to have picked in the courtyard and read Bible verses to the feverish child in a soft, soothing voice. To Matron Hewitt and the other staff, Sarah's kindness was touching, proof that even in this harsh place, children could show compassion to one another. But Walcott watched through the infirmary door and saw something different. He saw Sarah studying Emma's face with that same absorbed concentration she had shown with Mary Brennan's corpse. He saw her lean close to examine the infected wound, her small nose wrinkling slightly at the smell of corruption. He saw her press her fingers gently against Emma's forehead, testing the heat of the fever the way a cook might test the temperature of an oven. Emma survived, though she would walk with a limp for the rest of her life. The infection finally responded to treatment, and the fever broke after 6 days of crisis. When Emma was well enough to answer questions, Walcott asked her about the moments before her injury. The child's account was simple and devastating. Sarah had suggested they remove their shoes to feel the grass between their toes. It was such a hot day, Sarah had said, and the cool grass would feel wonderful. Emma had agreed eagerly. Sarah had led her to a specific spot in the courtyard, positioned her carefully, and then stepped back. Emma had taken 1 step forward and felt the nail drive into her foot. When Walcott asked why Sarah had not also removed her shoes, Emma looked confused for a moment, then said that Sarah had told her she could not because Matron Hewitt had scolded her the day before for going barefoot. It was a perfect excuse, perfectly delivered, and it had put Emma exactly where Sarah wanted her. In late July, Walcott discovered Sarah's hidden collection, and it destroyed any remaining doubt about what she was. The asylum's main building had numerous storage areas, abandoned rooms, and forgotten corners where children could find privacy. Sarah had claimed one of these spaces, a small crawl space beneath the back stairwell, accessible only through a panel that most adults would never notice and could not fit through. Walcott only discovered it because he had begun following Sarah during her free hours, documenting her movements from a distance. One afternoon, he watched her slip into the crawl space carrying something wrapped in cloth. She emerged 15 minutes later, empty-handed, brushed dust from her dress with quick, efficient movements, and returned to the children's common room as if nothing had happened. After she left, Walcott approached the panel. It was slightly ajar. Not much, just a finger's width, but enough to notice if you were looking for it. He forced himself through the narrow opening, his larger frame barely fitting through the gap, the rough wood scraping his shoulders and back. The space beyond was cramped, dark, and smelled of earth and old wood. Walcott lit a candle and held it up. What he saw in that flickering light would appear in his nightmares for the rest of his life. The crawlspace had been transformed into a workshop. Animal bones were sorted by size and type, arranged in neat rows along one wall. Rabbit skulls, bird wings, cat vertebrae, each cleaned and labeled with small tags written in Sarah's careful handwriting. Crude surgical instruments fashioned from stolen kitchen implements and bent wire lay on a flat board that served as a workbench. A piece of broken mirror was propped against the wall, presumably for better visibility during dissections. But what made Walcott's hands shake so badly he nearly dropped the candle was the collection of papers carefully stacked in the driest corner of the space. The first stack contained pages torn from medical texts. Walcott recognized them immediately as coming from his own library. Sarah had stolen them piece by piece over weeks or months, selecting illustrations of human anatomy, descriptions of the circulatory system, diagrams showing the location of major organs and blood vessels. She had annotated these stolen pages with her own notes, underlining key passages and adding observations in the margins. The second stack was Sarah's own work, drawings and detailed written observations. The artistic quality was remarkable for a 10-year-old, showing both natural talent and countless hours of practice. She had rendered rabbits, chickens, cats, and other small animals in various stages of dissection and injury, each illustration showing anatomical knowledge that would be sophisticated even for a medical student. One drawing showed a rabbit in profile with careful labels identifying the heart, lungs, and major blood vessels. Beside it, Sarah had written, "Heart continues beating 143 seconds after cervical fracture. Breathing stops at 89 seconds. Eyes remain responsive to light for 34 seconds after breathing stops. Interesting that different systems fail at different rates." Another page documented chicken vocalizations. When pressure applied to left wing, high-pitched distress call, approximately 3 seconds duration. Right wing, similar call, but 2 seconds duration. Leg, lower pitch sound, longer duration, 5 to 7 seconds. Neck, brief squawk, then silence. Note: neck appears most efficient method for rapid termination. A third showed a cat's skeletal structure with detailed notes about which bones would break most easily and in what order. Ribs, easy to fracture, but animal remains mobile and vocal. Front legs, radius breaks cleanly with moderate pressure, causes immediate collapse. Hind legs, requires more force. Spine, multiple attempts needed, unpredictable results. Recommend focus on neck for consistency. Walcott read these clinical descriptions of torture with his stomach churning. But worse was yet to come. Beneath the animal studies lay a newer set of papers, Sarah's human research. These drawings were less detailed than the animal work, more speculative, but they showed unmistakably that Sarah had moved beyond animal subjects in her thinking. One sketch showed a small figure at the bottom of a staircase with precise annotations about angles of impact, probable fracture points, and estimates of force required to produce fatal versus non-fatal injuries. The figure's position matched exactly where Thomas Whitmore had landed after his fall. Another drawing depicted a child's face in progressive stages with careful documentation of laudanum poisoning. Stage 1, pupils constrict, breathing slows. Stage 2, skin becomes pale, lips show blue tinge. Stage 3, unconsciousness, cannot be awakened. Stage 4, breathing becomes shallow and irregular. Stage 5, breathing stops. Heart continues briefly. Estimated total time from ingestion to death in small child, 4-6 hours. Every detail matched what Walcott had observed in Mary Brennan's death. But the most chilling document was a large, carefully rendered map of the asylum's main building and grounds. Sarah had drawn it with architectural precision, showing all 3 floors, the courtyards, the outbuildings, the well. Various locations were marked with small symbols and notes in her neat script. Medicine cabinet, key on nail, unlocked between 9:11 p.m. during rounds. 3rd floor stairs, railing loose on east side, 14 steps to bottom. Kitchen, knives stored in unlocked drawer, cook leaves at 7 p.m. Well in courtyard, no safety rail, depth approximately 40 feet, water level at 12 feet. Laundry building, contains lye soap, rat poison in back room. Attic door, no lock, access to roof. Sarah had been mapping vulnerabilities for weeks, perhaps months. She had cataloged every dangerous substance, every structural weakness, every moment when supervision was lax. She had created a reference guide for causing harm throughout the entire facility. Walcott sat in that cramped space for nearly an hour, copying the most damning drawings and notes into his journal with hands that would not stop trembling. He replaced everything exactly as he had found it, backed out of the crawl space, and made his way to his quarters. That night he wrote, "I now possess proof of what Sarah is. drawings that document past killings and plans for future ones, evidence of systematic torture of animals in the name of research, a mind that studies death with the same dispassionate curiosity that other children bring to collecting flowers or catching butterflies. But this proof implicates me as well. These drawings reference knowledge she could only have gained by observing my medical work, reading my books, listening to my explanations of anatomy and pharmacology. I have been teaching her, all unknowing, how to kill more efficiently. God forgive me. I have been her mentor in murder. He did not sleep that night. Instead, he paced his small room and argued with himself. He should report this immediately. Show the drawings to the asylum administrator, to the county sheriff, to anyone with the authority to remove Sarah from the facility. But every time he reached for his coat to do exactly that, doubt stopped him. Who would believe that a 10-year-old girl had created these documents? Would they not assume that Walcott himself had drawn them, that his mind had been damaged by too many years working with the insane? And how would he explain having access to Sarah's secret hiding place without admitting that he had been following a child, watching her, suspecting her for weeks without reporting his concerns? By morning, he had convinced himself to wait, to gather more evidence, to document one more incident that would make the case undeniable. It was a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. In early August, Sarah provided that incident, though not in any way that Walcott could have anticipated. 8-year-old Daniel Pierce was a simple boy, slow in his learning but sweet-natured and trusting. He loved the outdoor recreation periods when the children were allowed to explore the wooded area at the edge of the asylum grounds. He collected interesting stones, watched birds, and sometimes brought back wildflowers to give to Matron Hewitt. On August 12th, Daniel returned from outdoor recreation clutching his stomach and complaining of terrible pain. By evening, he was vomiting violently and could not stand without assistance. Walcott examined him and found dilated pupils, excessive salivation, and severe abdominal cramping, classic signs of poisoning. When questioned about what he had eaten, Daniel said that Sarah had found mushrooms growing in the woods, beautiful white mushrooms with delicate gills. She had identified them as the same kind that grew near the church, where people sometimes picked them for cooking. She had suggested that Daniel try one to see if they were as good as the church mushrooms. He had eaten 3. Walcott immediately induced vomiting and administered activated charcoal, working frantically to purge the poison from the boy's system. Daniel survived, but barely, and spent 4 days in the infirmary in agony. The morning after Daniel's poisoning, Walcott walked into the woods and found the spot where the mushrooms had been growing. Sarah's description was accurate. They were white, delicate, and did resemble edible species that grew elsewhere on the grounds. But these were destroying angels, Amanita virosa, one of the deadliest mushrooms in North America. They grew in a shadowy section of the woods that Walcott had never seen children explore before. More importantly, this particular species did not grow anywhere near the church. Sarah would have had to deliberately seek out these specific mushrooms, learn to identify them, and then construct a plausible lie about their safety to convince Daniel to eat them. That afternoon, Walcott did something he had sworn he would not do. He went directly to the asylum's administrator, a stern Presbyterian minister named Reverend Marcus Thornhill, and requested a private meeting. The confrontation in Thornhill's office went exactly as badly as Walcott had feared. He presented his case carefully, starting with the pattern of accidents, the dead animals, the contaminated nail, and finally, Daniel's poisoning. He showed Thornhill copies of Sarah's drawings that he had made in his journal. He explained his observations of her complete lack of emotional response to others' suffering. Thornhill listened in silence, his face growing progressively darker. When Walcott finished, the Reverend stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. Then he turned and delivered his verdict. "Dr. Walcott, you are describing a 10-year-old orphan girl as if she were some kind of monster. A child who has lost everything, who witnessed her family's death, who has been placed in our care precisely because she needs Christian guidance and medical treatment. And you are telling me that this child is a calculating murderer." Walcott tried to interrupt, but Thornhill held up one hand. I have watched Sarah Ann Miller since she arrived. I have seen her pray with genuine devotion. I have seen her help younger children, comfort the distressed, and conduct herself with more Christian charity than many adults in my congregation. What you are describing is impossible. Children are not born evil, Doctor. They are corrupted by evil influences, by trauma, by Satan's temptation. They can be saved through prayer, discipline, and proper guidance. The Reverend's voice grew harder. As for these drawings, how do I know that Sarah created them? How do I know that you did not create them yourself in some fit of paranoid delusion? You admit that you have been following this child, watching her in secret, suspecting her of horrible crimes based on nothing but your own interpretation of her behavior. Frankly, Doctor, your conduct raises more concerns than hers. Walcott felt the ground shifting beneath him. Reverend, I am not mad. The evidence, Thornhill interrupted, is that children have accidents, that a simple boy ate poisonous mushrooms because he does not know better, that you have become obsessed with an innocent child for reasons I cannot fathom. I will not entertain these accusations further, and I strongly suggest that you limit your interactions with Sarah Ann Miller to essential medical care only. Do I make myself clear? Walcott left the meeting in a daze. He had accomplished nothing except making himself appear unstable in the eyes of his superior, and he realized with cold certainty that any future attempt to expose Sarah would be seen as evidence of his own mental deterioration, not hers. That night, he wrote in his journal, I am trapped. Sarah has created a perfect situation where any accusation I make against her reflects back on me, and I realize now that this was her intention all along. She has been building this trap carefully, making herself indispensable to the staff, performing virtue for all to see, while simultaneously conducting her experiments and leaving just enough evidence for me to find. She wanted me to report her. She wanted me to be dismissed as paranoid, and I walked directly into the snare. On August 15th, Sarah confirmed everything Walcott feared. He was in his office reviewing patient records when there was a soft knock at his door. He opened it to find Sarah standing in the hallway, her hands folded neatly, her expression composed and respectful. She asked if she might speak with him privately. It was about something important. Walcott felt every muscle in his body tense, but he stepped aside and allowed her to enter. He closed the door, moved to stand behind his desk, keeping the heavy piece of furniture between them, and asked what she needed. Sarah walked to the chair across from his desk but did not sit. Instead, she ran one small finger along the top of the chair's back, tracing patterns in the wood grain. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, conversational, almost friendly. She said she wanted to thank him for trying to protect the other children. It showed that he cared about them, which was admirable in a physician. Most doctors at institutions like this saw patients as problems to be managed, not people to be protected. But Dr. Walcott was different. He actually noticed when things happened. He actually investigated. That was rare and valuable. Walcott stood frozen, unable to speak. Sarah continued, still tracing patterns on the chair, not looking at him. She said she had known he was watching her for quite some time. Weeks, actually. She had noticed him following her, seen him examining places where accidents had occurred, observed him asking the other children careful questions. He was very thorough, very methodical. She appreciated that attention to detail. She paused, and her fingers stopped moving. Then she looked up and met his eyes directly. She asked him a question. Did he really think she would have left her workspace accessible by accident? Did he truly believe that she, who planned everything else so carefully, would simply fail to notice that the panel was slightly ajar on the exact day he happened to be following her? Walcott felt his blood turn to ice. Sarah smiled. Not the practiced smile she showed to Matron Hewitt, but something genuine, something that held a terrible kind of warmth. She explained, with the patient tone of a teacher correcting a student's misunderstanding, that she had wanted him to find the crawl space. She had wanted him to see the drawings and notes, because she needed to know what kind of man he was. She said she had been studying him just as carefully as he had been studying her. She had noticed his growing suspicion, his increased presence near her activities, the way he watched her when he thought she could not see. She needed to know whether he would report what he suspected or whether he would remain silent. So she had provided him with evidence, undeniable, documented proof of what she was, and waited to see what he would do. Her voice remained soft, almost kind. "You did nothing, Dr. Walcott. You documented and worried and watched, but you did not report me. Not until I gave you Daniel, and even then, Reverend Thornhill did not believe you. So now I know exactly what kind of man you are. You are afraid that no one will believe you. You are afraid of appearing mad. And most importantly, you are curious about what I am. Curious enough to keep watching rather than acting." She moved around the chair now, walking slowly toward his desk. Walcott wanted to order her to stop, to maintain distance, but his throat had closed completely. Sarah stopped at the edge of the desk and placed both small hands flat on its surface. She leaned forward slightly, her pale eyes locked on his face. She told him, with perfect composure, that he would not report her again, because doing so would require him to admit that he had known about her activities for months and had done nothing to stop them. It would require him to explain how a 10-year-old girl had gained access to medical knowledge and materials under his direct supervision. Any investigation of her would become an investigation of him. He was already suspect in Reverend Thornhill's eyes. Another accusation would likely result in his dismissal, possibly even commitment to an asylum himself. Then she made him an offer, delivered in the same reasonable tone one might use to discuss a business arrangement. She said she would be more careful. She would stop the experiments that were obvious enough to draw attention. She would ensure that any future incidents could not be traced back to her with certainty. In exchange, he would continue his work as the asylum's physician, and occasionally, when appropriate, he would answer her questions about human anatomy and medicine. Just simple questions, the kind a curious child might ask. Nothing that would make him uncomfortable. She called it a compromise between two intelligent people who understood each other. Walcott finally found his voice. It came out as a hoarse whisper. "Why? Why do you do this? Why do you hurt them?" Sarah straightened, removing her hands from the desk. She considered the question with that characteristic gesture, but this time Walcott recognized it for what it was. Not a childish habit, but a deliberate pause to construct the most effective response. When she answered, her voice held no defensiveness, no shame, no emotion at all. Just simple, factual explanation. "I don't feel the things that make other people stop, Dr. Walcott. When I hurt something, I don't feel bad about it. I don't feel anything except curious about what will happen next. You ask me why as if there should be a reason, but there isn't one. It's like asking why birds fly, or why water runs downhill, or why my heart beats. These things just happen because of what they are, and I do what I do because of what I am." She moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the knob. Without turning back, she added one final observation. "You want to understand me because you think understanding will give you power over me. But understanding just makes it worse, doesn't it? Because now you know that I'm not sick or possessed or corrupted. I'm just built differently, and there's no treatment for that. No prayer that will fix it. No punishment that will change it. I will always be exactly what I am." She opened the door, stepped into the hallway, and closed it quietly behind her. Walcott sat in his office for 3 hours after Sarah left, unable to move, unable to think clearly. When he finally returned to his quarters that night, he wrote in his journal with handwriting so erratic it was barely legible. "She has turned the trap I thought I was setting for her into a trap for me. I am not observing her. She is observing me. I am not protecting the other children. I am protecting her by my very silence. And I have become part of her experiment, a test subject to see how a man of science behaves when confronted with evil he can recognize but cannot prove, cannot stop, cannot escape. She is 10 years old, and she has outmaneuvered me completely. For 3 weeks after their conversation, the accidents at Riverside Asylum stopped entirely. No child was injured. No animals were found dead. Sarah attended her lessons, performed her chores, and continued to be the model patient that Matron Hewitt praised at every opportunity. To everyone else, this was evidence that Walcott's concerns had been baseless paranoia. But the doctor knew the truth. Sarah had not stopped. She had simply learned perfect camouflage. And somewhere in the asylum, in a new hiding place he had not yet discovered, she was continuing her studies, refining her methods, preparing for whatever came next. Walcott began sleeping with his door locked and his medical bag beside his bed. He checked his food for signs of tampering before eating. He avoided being alone in empty corridors or isolated sections of the building. He had finally understood the full scope of his situation. He was no longer just an observer of Sarah Ann Miller's development into something monstrous. He was now a potential subject for her curiosity. And if she ever decided that studying him more closely required his death, he had given her every tool she would need to accomplish it without detection. She knew his routines, his weaknesses, his medical knowledge. She knew which substances in his own pharmacy would kill him and how much would be required. She knew he suffered from occasional insomnia and took small doses of chloral hydrate to sleep. She knew that if he died suddenly, it would likely be attributed to natural causes or self-administered overdose, especially given Reverend Thornhill's existing doubts about his mental stability. In the margins of his journal, written in handwriting that grew more erratic with each passing day, Walcott repeated a single question over and over. "What have I done? What have I done? What have I done?" But he knew the answer. He had chosen curiosity over action. He had chosen to study a monster instead of stopping her. And now he was trapped in a cage of his own making, waiting to see whether Sarah would decide he was more valuable as a teacher or more interesting as a victim. The last entry from August 1874 consisted of a single line, written so hard that the pen tore through the paper. "God help me. God help us all. She is still hungry." Chapter 3. The night the asylum burned. September 1874 brought an early frost to Missouri, and with it a change in Sarah Ann Miller that Dr. Isaac Walcott noted with growing dread in his increasingly frantic journal entries. She had become quieter, more withdrawn from the other children, spending long hours in solitary activities that he could not observe without making his surveillance obvious. When he did catch glimpses of her, she seemed preoccupied, her attention turned inward as if working through some complex problem that required all her concentration. Walcott recognized this behavior. He had seen it before in patients preparing to act on long-held obsessions. It was the silence that preceded violence, the stillness before the storm breaks. Something was coming. He could feel it in the way Sarah looked at him during his medical rounds, not with hostility or fear, but with a kind of clinical assessment, as if measuring him for a purpose he could not yet discern. His journal entry from September 3rd revealed a man teetering on the edge of complete psychological collapse. "I have not slept more than 2 hours in any night this week. Every sound in the corridor makes me start awake, my heart pounding. Every meal might be poisoned. I have begun preparing my own food in secret, using supplies I keep locked in my quarters. Every moment of inattention might be my last. I am living in a state of perpetual siege, and my enemy is a 10-year-old girl who smiles at me each morning and wishes me good day with perfect courtesy." He had begun losing weight. His hands trembled when performing medical examinations. Other staff members had started to notice his deterioration, whispering that perhaps Dr. Walcott had been at the asylum too long, that the constant exposure to madness was affecting his own mind. He knew what they said about him, and he knew that their doubts only strengthened Sarah's position. The madder he appeared, the more credible she became. On September 8th, 12-year-old Rebecca Hartwell disappeared, and Walcott's worst fears began to crystallize into terrible certainty. Rebecca was one of the asylum's oldest juvenile patients, a melancholic girl who rarely spoke and spent most of her time staring out windows at the Missouri countryside beyond. She had been committed after attempting to drown herself in a creek following her mother's death from consumption. The staff generally left her alone, as she caused no trouble and seemed content in her silent withdrawal from the world. She was, in many ways, invisible, the perfect subject for someone who needed to conduct experiments without drawing attention. When Rebecca failed to appear for morning assembly, Matron Hewitt assumed the girl was having one of her dark episodes and had retreated to some corner to weep in solitude. But by noon, when Rebecca had not been found anywhere in the main building, a full search was organized. Staff and older patients spread throughout the grounds, calling her name, checking every room and closet and storage area. Walcott joined the search with a terrible certainty growing in his chest like a physical weight. He knew, though he could not have explained how, that this disappearance was not coincidence or a melancholic girl wandering off. This was Sarah's work, but to what purpose, he could not imagine. Rebecca was not a child Sarah had shown any interest in previously. She was not particularly vulnerable, not notably cruel or kind, not remarkable in any way that would draw a predator's attention. Unless that very ordinariness, that invisibility, was exactly what made her valuable. The search expanded to the asylum's outbuildings as afternoon faded toward evening. Walcott found himself assigned to check the old laundry building, a stone structure at the far edge of the property that had been largely abandoned after a newer facility was built closer to the main house. The building was used only for storage now, filled with broken equipment and supplies that no one had bothered to discard. He approached the building as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the overgrown grass that surrounded it. The door hung partially open on rusted hinges, and he could smell the familiar scents of lye soap and mildew that permeated all such places. He called Rebecca's name as he entered, his voice echoing in the empty space, disturbing dust motes that danced in the fading light. The main washing room was empty, as were the sorting areas and storage closets. But at the back of the building, half hidden behind a stack of broken wash tubs, Walcott found a narrow staircase leading down to a cellar he had not known existed. The door at the bottom stood open, and from the darkness below came a sound that made every hair on his body stand on end. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming on wood in an endless, mindless pattern. Walcott descended with his lantern held high, each wooden step creaking under his weight, the sound echoing in the confined space. The air grew colder as he went deeper, and the smell changed from mildew to something earthier, more organic. Damp soil and old stone, and something else he could not immediately identify. The cellar was larger than he expected, stretching back into shadows that his lantern light could not fully penetrate. Old washing equipment lined the walls, broken tubs filled with stagnant water, rusted mangles with their rollers frozen in place, wooden paddles and stirring poles propped in corners like abandoned sentinels. Rebecca Hartwell sat in the far corner, her back against the stone wall, her legs drawn up to her chest. Her eyes were open but unseeing, fixed on some point in the middle distance that held no meaning. For one terrible moment, Walcott thought she was dead, that he had arrived too late to save another of Sarah's victims. Then Rebecca blinked, and he saw that she was alive but locked in some kind of waking trance. Her right hand moved mechanically, tapping her fingers against the stone floor in that rhythmic pattern he had heard from above. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. An endless loop that she seemed completely unaware of performing. Walcott rushed to her side, his medical training overriding his horror. He knelt beside her and began a rapid examination. Her pupils were massively dilated, barely responsive to his lantern light. Her pulse was rapid and thready, her heartbeat irregular. Her skin was cold and clammy to the touch, covered in a sheen of sweat despite the chill of the cellar. She did not respond to his voice or his touch, continuing that mindless tapping as if she were somewhere far away, trapped in some internal landscape he could not access. He recognized the symptoms immediately. She had been drugged, heavily, with a combination of substances that had produced this dissociative state. Chloral hydrate, certainly, given the sedation. But something else as well, something that had dilated her pupils to that unnatural degree. belladonna, probably, or some other alkaloid from his medicine cabinet. As he was preparing to lift Rebecca and carry her back to the main building for treatment, he noticed something that made him pause. The girl's left hand clutched a piece of paper, her fingers wrapped around it so tightly that the knuckles had gone white. He had to pry her fingers open one by one to retrieve it, her hand resisting even in her unconscious state, as if some part of her mind knew that what she held was important. The paper was covered in Sarah's distinctive handwriting. Neat, careful, meticulously organized. Walcott read it by the flickering lantern light, and with each line, his understanding of what Sarah had become shifted into even darker territory than he had imagined possible. It was not a note or a confession. It was a research document, as clinically detailed and methodically organized as any paper he might have written for a medical journal. Sarah had created a complete experimental protocol, documenting every aspect of what she had done to Rebecca. Experimental protocol: chemical management of resistant subjects. Subject: Rebecca Hartwell, female, age 12 years, approximate weight 85 pounds. Medical history includes melancholic disposition and one previous suicide attempt via drowning. Objective: test effects of combined chloral hydrate and belladonna tincture on consciousness, motor function, and suggestibility. Primary hypothesis: proper combination will produce state of waking unconsciousness, where subject remains ambulatory and responsive to simple commands, but retains no awareness or memory of events. Secondary hypothesis: this state can be maintained for extended periods, 4 to 6 hours, without producing fatal respiratory depression. Methodology: 9:00 a.m. Initial administration: 15 grains chloral hydrate dissolved in morning tea. Subject's regular beverage, consumed without suspicion. Expected effect: drowsiness, reduced anxiety, increased compliance. 9:45 a.m. Observed effect: subject became noticeably drowsy but remained conscious and conversant. Mild slurring of speech noted. Pupil response normal, coordination slightly impaired. 10:30 a.m. Second administration: 10 grains chloral hydrate plus 2 drops belladonna tincture dissolved in water, offered as medicine to help you feel better. Subject accepted without resistance. 11:00 a.m. Observed effect: speech severely slurred. Pupils began dilating. Subject responded to questions with delayed, confused answers. Coordination significantly impaired, required assistance to stand. 11:15 a.m. Subject successfully led from dormitory to laundry building cellar via back route. Distance approximately 400 yards. Subject walked unassisted but required verbal guidance at each turn. No resistance offered. No calls for help. No apparent awareness of unusual nature of situation. 11:30 a.m. Subject positioned in cellar corner and given instruction to sit and wait. Subject complied immediately and has remained stationary for 3 hours 15 minutes at time of this notation. Observations: subject exhibits continuous repetitive movement, right hand tapping, suggesting some residual motor function despite apparent unconsciousness of surroundings. Pupils remain maximally dilated with minimal light response. Respiratory rate: 14 breaths per minute, slightly depressed but within safe range. Heart rate: 96 beats per minute, elevated but not dangerously so. Subject does not respond to verbal stimuli, name called multiple times, no reaction. Subject shows no signs of distress, fear, or discomfort. No evidence of nausea or other adverse effects. Conclusions: method confirmed highly effective for producing compliant, manageable state in resistant or potentially resistant subjects. Subject can be moved, positioned, and left unattended without risk of alarm or escape. Memory formation appears completely suppressed. Ideal for procedures requiring subject cooperation without subsequent recollection. Dosage appears safe for subject of this age and weight. No concerning vital sign changes observed. Applications: this protocol will be implemented in final operational plan for managing multiple subjects simultaneously during extended procedure. Estimated requirement: 6-8 subjects requiring chemical management for a period of approximately 2 to 3 hours while primary objectives are completed. Note: must ensure subjects are positioned in locations where they will be discovered after procedure completion, but not so quickly that discovery interferes with primary objectives. Timing critical. Walcott read the document 3 times, his hands shaking so badly that the paper rattled. Each reading brought new layers of horror. This was not the work of a child acting on impulse or curiosity. This was the work of a trained researcher conducting human experimentation with the same methodical precision that he himself brought to his medical studies. But worse than the clinical tone was what the document revealed about Sarah's plans. She was not testing drugs on Rebecca out of simple curiosity. This was a rehearsal. She was preparing to do this to multiple people, 6-8 subjects, during some extended procedure that would require them to be unconscious and compliant for hours. And she had written, "Final operational plan." Final. This was Sarah's endgame, whatever it might be. And she was testing the methods she would need to execute it. Walcott lifted Rebecca carefully in his arms and carried her up the stairs and back toward the main building. She weighed almost nothing, her body limp and unresisting. With each step, his mind raced through terrible possibilities. What was Sarah planning? Who were the subjects she intended to drug? And what was this extended procedure that required multiple people to be unconscious simultaneously? The walk back seemed to take hours, though it was probably less than 10 minutes. Every shadow looked like Sarah watching him. Every sound made him flinch. He kept expecting her to step out from behind a tree or building, to confront him, to explain with that calm, clinical voice exactly what she intended to do and why he could not stop her. Rebecca recovered physically within 2 days, her young body metabolizing the drugs without lasting damage. But she had no memory of anything that happened after drinking her morning tea. When Walcott questioned her gently about Sarah, about being led to the cellar, about the hours she had spent in that dissociative state, she looked at him with genuine confusion. As far as Rebecca was concerned, she had simply fallen ill and been found by the kind doctor. The drugs had done exactly what Sarah's notes suggested they would, created a period of total amnesia during which Rebecca could be moved, positioned, studied, and abandoned without her conscious mind registering any of it. Walcott kept Sarah's research document hidden in his journal, folded between pages where no casual observer would find it. He knew he should show it to Reverend Thornhill, to the county authorities, to someone with the power to remove Sarah from the asylum immediately and permanently. But his previous attempt at reporting Sarah had destroyed his credibility completely. If he presented this document now, Thornhill would claim that Walcott himself had written it, that his obsession with Sarah had crossed from suspicion into fabrication of evidence. The handwriting could be attributed to Walcott forcing Sarah to copy something he had dictated, or even Walcott himself creating a forgery. There was no way to prove the document's authenticity beyond reasonable doubt, and the implications of the document's final section filled him with a terror that made rational thought nearly impossible. Sarah had a plan, something she had been building toward for months, something that required testing and preparation and the ability to manage multiple unconscious victims simultaneously. He was certain, with the grim certainty of a man watching his own execution being prepared, that he would play a central role in whatever she intended. On September 17th, 9 days after Rebecca's disappearance, Sarah broke her silence and confirmed every one of Walcott's nightmares. She appeared at his office during the evening hours, well after dark, long after most of the staff had retired to their quarters and the children were supposedly locked in their dormitories for the night. Walcott had been writing in his journal, documenting his latest observations and trying to construct some plan of action that would not result in his own institutionalization, when he heard the soft knock at his door. He knew who it was before he stood. He had been expecting this visit for days, dreading it, lying awake at night imagining how it would unfold. When he pulled the door open, Sarah stood in the hallway dressed in her nightgown, her feet bare, her blonde hair loose around her shoulders. She looked like any other child roused from sleep, small, vulnerable, innocent. except that her pale blue eyes were bright and alert, showing no trace of drowsiness, and her expression held something that might have been anticipation. She asked in that soft, respectful voice she used with all adults, if they could speak privately. She had questions, medical questions, important ones. Every instinct screamed at Walcott to refuse, to send her away, to call for Matron Hewitt and have Sarah return to her dormitory under guard. But he knew that refusal would accomplish nothing. If Sarah wanted answers, she would get them one way or another. She had already demonstrated her ability to access his medical texts, his supplies, his knowledge. At least if he spoke with her directly, he might learn something about her intentions. He might find some clue that would help him stop what was coming. It was a rationalization, and he knew it even as he stepped aside to let her enter. But it was the same rationalization he had been using for months. That observation and engagement would somehow give him an advantage, when in reality it only drew him deeper into complicity. Sarah walked to the chair across from his desk and sat down, arranging her nightgown with the precise, practiced movements of someone much older. She folded her small hands in her lap and looked at him with an expression that was almost friendly, as if they were colleagues meeting to discuss shared research interests rather than a physician being interrogated by a child murderer. Walcott closed the door. He could not risk this conversation being overheard, and moved to stand behind his desk, keeping the heavy piece of furniture between them. He found some small comfort in that barrier, though he knew it was meaningless. If Sarah wanted to harm him, a desk would not protect him. She began with a direct question, no preamble or pretense. How much chloroform would be required to keep an adult man unconscious for approximately 30 minutes? The question hit Walcott like a physical blow. His mouth went dry, and for a moment he could not speak. When he found his voice, it came out hoarse. Why would you need to know that? Sarah's expression did not change. Her voice remained calm, curious, academically interested. I'm curious about anesthesia. You use it during surgical procedures. I've watched you administer it 3 times now, and I've read about it in your medical texts. But the books give dosages for surgery, which can last hours. I'm interested in shorter periods of unconsciousness, 30 to 45 minutes, for theoretical purposes, of course. There was nothing theoretical about her question, and they both knew it. This was Sarah gathering specific information for her final operational plan, whatever nightmare she had been methodically preparing. Walcott's mind raced through possibilities, each worse than the last. He considered lying, providing false information that might sabotage her intentions. Tell her that chloroform required massive doses for even brief unconsciousness, that it was too unpredictable to use safely, that it would kill rather than sedate. But he had already made that mistake once, early in their relationship, when he had deliberately misstated laudanum dosages hoping to discourage her experiments. Sarah had tested his false information on Mary Brennan, and the child had died in agony. If he lied now and Sarah tested his false information on another victim, or worse, on multiple victims during this extended procedure she was planning, he would be directly responsible for their suffering. She would use too much or too little, someone would die or wake up at the wrong moment, and the blood would be on his hands as surely as if he had administered the poison himself. But if he told the truth, he would be giving her exactly what she needed to execute whatever plan she had developed. He would be an active participant in whatever horror she intended to unleash. He stood there behind his desk, frozen between 2 impossible choices, while Sarah watched him with those empty eyes and waited patiently for his answer. The silence stretched for nearly a minute. Walcott counted the ticks of his pocket watch, each one like a hammer blow. Finally, he spoke, hating himself even as the words left his mouth. It depends on the size and health of the subject. For an average adult male in good health, approximately 2 to 3 drams on a cloth held over the nose and mouth would produce unconsciousness within 2 to 3 minutes. The subject would remain unconscious for 30 to 45 minutes, possibly longer if additional small doses were administered. Sarah's expression brightened slightly. Not quite a smile, but something close to satisfaction. She produced a small notebook from the pocket of her nightgown and began writing, her pencil scratching across the paper with quick, efficient strokes. "And the signs of chloroform administration?" she asked without looking up from her notes. "If someone were found unconscious, how would a physician determine whether chloroform had been used?" Walcott answered, his voice sounding distant to his own ears, as if someone else were speaking. "The smell is distinctive, sweet, slightly fruity. It lingers on the breath and clothing for several hours. In larger doses, it can cause skin irritation where the cloth contacted the face. But if used properly and in moderate amounts, physical signs are minimal. The subject would simply appear to be in natural deep sleep." Sarah nodded, still writing. Then she asked her next question, and Walcott felt his remaining hope crumble to ash. "And what about after death? If someone died while unconscious from chloroform, from smoke inhalation during a fire, for example, would examination of the body reveal that they had been drugged first?" The room seemed to tilt around Walcott. The pieces were falling into place now, forming a picture so horrifying that his mind rebelled against fully accepting it. Chloroform to incapacitate victims, a fire, multiple subjects, smoke inhalation as cause of death. Sarah was going to burn something, somewhere, with people inside. She was going to drug them first so they could not escape, then set a fire that would kill them while they lay unconscious. And she wanted to know whether a physician examining the bodies afterward would be able to detect the chloroform, or whether the deaths would appear to be simple tragic accidents, victims overcome by smoke before they could escape the flames. "Dr. Walcott?" Sarah's voice pulled him back to the present. "The question about post-mortem detection of chloroform." He should refuse. He should grab her by the shoulders and shake her and demand that she tell him what she was planning. He should call for help, have her restrained, force Reverend Thornhill to listen regardless of the consequences to his own reputation and career. Instead, he answered her question. God help him, he answered. Chloroform metabolizes quickly and leaves minimal trace in bodily tissues. If someone died from smoke inhalation while unconscious from chloroform, a standard medical examination would likely attribute death solely to the smoke. The lungs would show characteristic damage from breathing superheated air. Carbon monoxide would be present in the blood, turning the skin a cherry red color. These signs would overwhelm any subtle indicators of prior drugging. He paused, then added with desperate hope that he might still derail her plans. But this only works if the person is alive when the fire starts. If they're already dead when the burning begins, the lungs will be clear, and there will be no carbon monoxide in the blood. An experienced physician would immediately recognize that death occurred before the fire, which would trigger a murder investigation. Sarah nodded thoughtfully, absorbing this information. So the subjects would need to be alive and breathing when the fire begins. Unconscious, but alive. That's important to know. She made another note, then looked up at him with something that might have been gratitude. Thank you, Dr. Walcott. That's very helpful. You've always been such an excellent teacher. She stood, smoothing her nightgown, preparing to leave. But Walcott could not let her go. Not yet. Not without at least attempting to reach whatever humanity might still exist beneath that cold, calculating exterior. Sarah, please. His voice cracked. Whatever you're planning, don't do it. You're 10 years old. You have your entire life ahead of you. You don't have to become this. There's still time to choose differently, to what? She interrupted, her voice remaining calm but with an edge of something that might have been curiosity. To feel what other people feel? To suddenly develop a conscience that makes me regret what I've done and want to be good? Dr. Walcott, you're an intelligent man. You've studied medicine, human anatomy, the workings of the body. You know that some things are fundamental to how an organism is constructed. You cannot teach a blind man to see by explaining colors. You cannot teach a deaf man to hear by describing music. And you cannot teach me to feel guilt or empathy or compassion, because the capacity for those feelings simply is not present in my mind. It was never there. It will never be there. She walked to the door, then paused with her hand on the knob, the same gesture she had used during their previous conversations, a pause for dramatic effect that she had clearly learned from observing others. Without turning back, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "You should know that I've enjoyed our time together. You're the only person here who understands what I am. That's rare and valuable. Most people never truly see me. They see only the performance, the mask I wear. But you see beneath it. You recognize the real Sarah. I appreciate that recognition, even if it terrifies you." "When will it happen?" Walcott asked, his voice hollow. "When are you going to do whatever you're planning?" Sarah opened the door, letting in a draft of cold September air from the corridor. "Soon, Dr. Walcott. Very soon. But don't worry. You won't be harmed. You're far too valuable as an observer. I want you to survive so you can remember me. So you can spend the rest of your life wondering what I became and where I went, and whether the people around you might be me, grown older, still practicing my craft." Then she was gone, the door closing softly behind her, leaving Walcott alone in his office with the terrible knowledge of what he had just done. He sank into his chair and stared at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. He had given a murderous child detailed information about chloroform anesthesia and how to make deaths in a fire appear accidental. He had done it knowingly, deliberately, choosing to answer her questions rather than refuse and face the consequences. He told himself that he had been trying to protect potential future victims by ensuring Sarah had accurate information rather than forcing her to experiment with incorrect dosages. But he knew the truth. He had answered because he was terrified of what she might do to him if he refused. He had answered because some part of him was still trying to maintain the fiction that observation and engagement gave him some measure of control. He had answered because he was weak and frightened, and had been so thoroughly manipulated that he could no longer distinguish between protecting others and protecting himself. That night he wrote in his journal with handwriting so erratic it was barely legible. "I have become what I feared most. Not a physician who failed to recognize evil. Not a guardian who failed to protect the innocent. I have become an active collaborator in evil, providing the knowledge and tools that Sarah needs to kill with impunity. God forgive me. I am her accomplice, and I am too much of a coward to stop it." Walcott spent the next week in a state of paralyzed terror that made his previous anxiety seem mild by comparison. He increased his nighttime patrols of the asylum from 1 round to 3, checking obsessively for signs of fire preparation, stored accelerants, blocked exits, stockpiles of chloroform or other anesthetic agents, anything that might indicate Sarah's plans were moving toward execution. He found nothing. He tried once more to warn Reverend Thornhill, this time framing his concerns as general worries about fire safety rather than specific accusations against Sarah. The institution's wooden construction, the abundance of lamp oil and other flammable materials, the inadequate number of fire buckets and emergency exits. All of these posed serious risks that should be addressed immediately. The Reverend thanked him for his diligence and promised to have the groundskeeper inspect all the lamp oil storage areas and ensure that fire buckets were properly distributed throughout the building. It was a meaningless gesture, and both men knew it. Thornhill was simply placating a physician he believed to be suffering from nervous exhaustion and possible delusions. On September 24th, 8 days after Sarah's midnight visit, Walcott made his final decision. He could not stop what was coming. He could not prove what he knew. The only thing he could still control was whether he would be present when Sarah's carefully laid trap finally sprang shut. He would leave. He would resign his position at Riverside Asylum, claim family obligations that required his return to Pennsylvania, and put as much distance as possible between himself and Sarah Ann Miller before her plan came to fruition. It was cowardice. He recognized it as such even as he acted on it. But it was also the only path to survival that remained open to him. He spent that evening composing his letter of resignation, citing the declining health of an elderly aunt in Philadelphia who required his care. The aunt was fictional, but the letter was plausible enough that Thornhill would accept it without excessive questioning. Walcott would leave at the end of the month, just 6 days away. 6 days to maintain his vigilance and pray that Sarah would wait until after his departure to implement whatever horror she had planned. He was still writing, making final revisions to the letter, when he smelled smoke seeping under his door. The fire started just after midnight on September 25, 1874, less than 3 hours after Walcott had finished his resignation letter. His first awareness was the acrid smell, not the pleasant scent of wood smoke from a fireplace, but the sharp chemical stench of accelerants burning. Then came shouts from the corridor, running footsteps, the high-pitched screaming of children waking to find their world engulfed in flames. Walcott grabbed his medical bag by instinct and rushed into the hallway to find chaos beyond anything his mind could have prepared for. Smoke poured from the eastern wing of the building, thick and black and moving with unnatural speed, as if driven by some malevolent force. Already the wooden walls were crackling with flames that seemed to leap from board to board with hungry intelligence. The heat was intense even from 20 feet away, forcing him to shield his face with his arm. Staff members ran through the corridors, pounding on doors, herding confused and terrified children toward the main staircase and the relative safety of the ground floor. Children stumbled past Walcott in their nightclothes, some crying, some too shocked to make sound, their eyes wide with animal terror. The smoke grew thicker with each passing second, burning his lungs, making his eyes stream with tears that had nothing to do with grief. Through the chaos, one thought repeated in his mind with crystal clarity. This is it. This is Sarah's final plan, and I gave her the knowledge to do it. Walcott pushed his way through the smoke toward the children's dormitories, counting heads as children streamed past him toward safety. His medical training took over, overriding his terror. Check for injuries, ensure no one was being trampled in the panic, guide the youngest ones toward the exits. But even as his body moved through the motions of rescue, his eyes scanned frantically for one particular small figure with blonde hair and pale blue eyes. He found Sarah on the second-floor landing, standing perfectly still while panicked children and staff rushed around her like water flowing around a stone in a river. She was fully dressed, not in her nightgown like the other children, but in her day clothes, clean and neat as if she were preparing for a normal morning. She carried a small cloth bag over one shoulder, the kind of traveling bag that might hold essential possessions and nothing more. When she saw Walcott, she smiled. That genuine smile he had seen only a handful of times, the smile that meant she was experiencing something close to pleasure. It was the smile of an artist viewing her completed masterpiece, the smile of a scientist watching a successful experiment, the smile of someone who had planned something meticulously and was now seeing it unfold exactly as designed. Their eyes met across the smoke-filled landing. For just a moment, everything else seemed to fall away, the screaming, the flames, the chaos. There was only Sarah and Walcott, predator and prey, monster and witness, teacher and student. Then she turned and walked calmly down the stairs toward the exit, moving against the current of people rushing upward to fight the fire, her small figure disappearing into the smoke and darkness like a ghost fading at dawn. Walcott tried to follow her, tried to grab her, tried to scream her name, but Matron Hewitt clutched his arm with terrified strength and shouted that there were still children trapped in the eastern dormitory. The fire had spread too quickly, cutting off access to that section of the building. He could hear them screaming, pounding on the door, crying for help with voices that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He abandoned his pursuit of Sarah and ran toward the eastern wing, his physician's oath overriding his terror and his desperate desire to stop the girl before she escaped into the world. Somewhere in his mind he knew that his choice in this moment would define him forever. Save children now, or chase a monster who was already gone. What he found in the eastern corridor destroyed whatever remained of his sanity. The dormitory door was blocked from the outside. Someone had wedged a heavy wooden beam against it, not just leaned it there, but secured it with rope tied to the opposite wall, creating a brace that would require significant force to dislodge. The beam was fresh, not aged like the building's other timbers. It had been placed there recently, deliberately, as part of a carefully executed plan. Through the door, Walcott could hear children screaming, pounding on the wood with small fists, crying for help in voices raw with terror and smoke inhalation. He could hear them calling names, for their mothers, for God, for Dr. Walcott. "Please help us, please, we can't breathe. Please don't let us burn." The smoke was already thick in the corridor, and flames were spreading along the ceiling with terrifying speed, running along the wooden beams like liquid fire. The heat was becoming unbearable. Walcott threw himself against the beam, using his full weight to try to dislodge it. The rope held. The beam held. The door remained closed. Two other staff members appeared through the smoke, groundskeeper Davies and one of the older male attendants. Together they attacked the beam, pulling at the rope, pushing against the wood, fighting against time and Sarah's careful engineering. The rope finally gave way with a snap, the beam fell, and the door burst open as the children inside threw their collective weight against it. 7 children poured out, coughing violently, their nightclothes singed by sparks, their faces black with soot. Some could barely walk. Walcott grabbed the nearest 2, small girls, no more than 5 or 6 years old, and lifted them into his arms. The other staff grabbed more children, and together they stumbled toward the main staircase, half carrying and half dragging their charges through smoke so thick they could barely see 2 feet ahead. Behind them, the ceiling of the eastern corridor collapsed with a roar that sounded like the end of the world. Flames shot up into the night sky, visible through windows that shattered from the heat, showering glass onto the lawn below. The entire wooden structure was being consumed with a speed that could only mean one thing. Accelerants had been carefully placed throughout the building to ensure maximum destruction and minimum time for escape. Outside, in the cold September night that tasted like freedom and smoke and death, Walcott helped organize the evacuation, his hands moving automatically through triage and treatment, while his mind remained trapped in that moment on the second-floor landing, watching Sarah smile and disappear into the darkness. Children huddled in shivering groups on the lawn, wrapped in blankets brought from the outbuildings. Staff members counted and recounted, trying to determine if anyone was missing through the confusion and panic. The volunteer fire brigade from the nearest town arrived within an hour, their wagon rattling up the long drive. But by then the main building was a total loss. All they could do was prevent the fire from spreading to the outbuildings and let the asylum burn itself out. As dawn broke over the smoldering ruins, painting the smoke-filled sky in shades of red and orange that looked like the end of days, Reverend Thornhill conducted a final head count, checking names against his roster of patients and staff. Everyone was accounted for, except one. Sarah Ann Miller was gone. The official investigation concluded within a week, reaching conclusions that Walcott knew were lies, but could not refute. The fire had been an accident, likely caused by an overturned lamp in one of the storage areas where lamp oil was kept. The beam blocking the eastern dormitory door was determined to be a piece of structural collapse during the fire, despite Walcott's insistence that it had been deliberately placed before the fire started. His account was noted in the report but largely dismissed, especially given Reverend Thornhill's detailed testimony about Walcott's previous paranoid accusations and deteriorating mental state. Sarah's disappearance was officially recorded as a tragedy. The prevailing theory was that she had panicked during the evacuation and fled into the surrounding woods, where she had either gotten lost in the darkness or succumbed to exposure. Search parties combed the area for 3 days but found no trace of her body or any evidence of her passage. This was not considered unusual. The woods were extensive, wild animals might have scattered remains, and the chaos of the fire could have disoriented even an intelligent child. Several people reported seeing a small figure matching Sarah's description walking along the main road leading away from the asylum in the hours after the fire, but these sightings were deemed unreliable. After all, many children had been evacuated in panic. In the darkness and confusion, witnesses could easily have been mistaken. Walcott knew better. He knew that Sarah had started the fire deliberately, using accelerants carefully positioned over weeks or months to ensure the building would burn quickly and completely. He knew she had blocked that dormitory door, calculating that someone would discover the trapped children before they died. creating terror and near-death experiences but not actual deaths, just as her letter would later confirm. He knew she had used the chaos to escape, carrying whatever documents and tools she needed for her next chapter of existence. But he had no proof. His journal was detailed and extensive, but it documented only his observations and suspicions. The physical evidence, Sarah's drawings, her research notes, her hidden workspace, the experimental protocols she had written, had all been consumed in the fire. It was perfect. She had destroyed all evidence of what she was, eliminated all documentation of her experiments, and created an opportunity for complete reinvention. A 10-year-old girl with no conscience, extensive knowledge of human anatomy and pharmacology, and years of practice in hiding her true nature behind a mask of perfect innocence, was now loose in the world. She had no verifiable family, no identity that could be definitively traced, no past that anyone could investigate. She could appear in any town, any orphanage, any family, and simply begin again. A new name, a new history, a new set of victims who would never suspect that the traumatized orphan they took into their homes was actually a predator who had killed more times than could be documented. 3 days after the fire, while clearing the ruins of his office, Walcott found something that transformed his horror into absolute certainty of his own damnation. Buried in the ash and charred debris, he discovered a small metal strongbox that had somehow survived the flames. The box was scorched and dented, its lock melted away, but the interior had protected its contents from complete destruction. Inside was a single letter, addressed to him in Sarah's careful, precise handwriting. The paper was singed at the edges, but still readable. The letter was dated September 24th, the same day he had written his resignation. Written while he had been planning his escape, while he had been convincing himself that leaving was the only rational choice. Sarah had known he was planning to flee, and she had left him a message. Dear Dr. Walcott, by the time you read this, I will be gone, and Riverside Asylum will exist only as ash and memory. I want you to know that this was always the intended conclusion to my work here. I have learned everything this place can teach me, conducted all the experiments that the available subjects permitted, and acquired sufficient knowledge of human anatomy, pharmacology, and behavioral manipulation to proceed to the next phase of my education. You have been an excellent teacher, Dr. Walcott. Far better than you realize, and certainly far better than you intended. Every answer you gave me, every time you explained the mechanics of death, or the signs of various poisons or the proper dosages of anesthetic agents, you were helping me become more effective at my work. I am genuinely grateful for that education. Most teachers refuse to instruct students in the subjects that truly matter. I want you to understand something important. I did not burn Riverside out of anger or revenge or any emotional motivation whatsoever. This was simply the most practical solution to several problems. The fire destroys all physical evidence of my experiments, the drawings, the notes, the animal remains that might have eventually been discovered. It creates official confusion about my disappearance, making me legally dead or missing rather than a fugitive. And it provides valuable data about human behavior during crisis situations. I was able to observe panic, decision-making under extreme pressure, physical responses to smoke inhalation, and the fascinating ways that people prioritize different types of life-saving actions. Very efficient use of resources. A single event that accomplished multiple research objectives simultaneously. The children in the Eastern dormitory were never in real danger of death, though I'm sure you believed they were. I calculated the timing carefully. The door was blocked for exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds, long enough to create genuine fear and moderate smoke exposure, but not long enough to cause fatal harm, assuming someone with your observational skills would investigate the screaming. You performed exactly as my behavioral model predicted. You always do, Dr. Walcott. You are remarkably consistent in your responses. I am telling you this so you will understand the full scope of what has occurred. You were not observing me. I was observing you. You were not protecting the other children. Your very silence and inaction protected me by making you appear unstable when you finally did try to report what you knew. And you have not been investigating my development as a case study in childhood pathology. You have been part of the experiment from the very beginning. I have been studying you as carefully as you thought you were studying me. Your responses to moral dilemmas, your capacity for rationalization, your inability to act decisively despite knowing what I am. All of it has been valuable data about how intelligent, educated people behave when confronted with evil they can recognize but cannot easily prove or stop. You represent a particular type of person, someone with sufficient knowledge to understand danger, but insufficient courage to confront it at personal cost. That is a useful category to understand. I will encounter many such people in my future work. You will spend the rest of your life wondering what happened to me, Dr. Walcott, where I went, who I became, what name I adopted, whether I married and had children, and if those children inherited my particular nature. Whether the people you encounter in your daily life might be me, grown older, perhaps surgically altered, still practicing my craft under a new identity. That uncertainty is my final gift to you, a permanent reminder of your failure to stop me when you had multiple opportunities to do so. You will never know for certain whether I am still alive. You will never know whether that kind nurse who cares for elderly patients in the hospital where you work might be me. You will never know whether the respectable woman who sits beside you in church might be me. You will never know whether the deaths that occur around you are natural or carefully orchestrated experiments. That not knowing will consume you. It will make you suspicious of everyone, paranoid about everything, unable to trust your own judgment about human nature. It will destroy you far more effectively than any poison I might have administered. Do not blame yourself too harshly, doctor. You are not the first intelligent person I have manipulated into complicity, and you will certainly not be the last. It is simply what I do, what I am, what I will always be. I wish you a long life, Dr. Walcott, not out of kindness, but because your continued existence serves my purposes. You will spend decades wondering whether you could have stopped me, whether the deaths that occur in your vicinity are connected to me, whether I have been watching you all along, studying your decline into paranoid obsession the way I once studied rabbits and chickens. The longer you live, the more you will suffer, and that suffering is valuable data. Thank you for your instruction. Thank you for your weakness. Thank you for being exactly what I needed you to be. With genuine appreciation, Sarah Ann Miller, or whoever I have chosen to become by the time you finish reading this. Dr. Isaac Walcott never showed the letter to anyone. He kept it hidden in his journal, sealed between pages that he read and reread in the years that followed, torturing himself with evidence of how completely he had been manipulated. The letter became both his confession and his penance, proof that he had not simply failed to stop a child murderer, but had actively participated in her education and enabled her escape. He did not return to Philadelphia. Instead, he spent the remaining 17 years of his life working in various asylums and institutions across the Midwest, taking positions that other physicians. Robert Chen had been an archivist for 15 years when he opened Dr. Isaac Walcott's journal in the winter of 1998. He had processed thousands of historical documents in his career, medical records, patient files, administrative correspondence from institutions that had long since been demolished or abandoned. Most of it was routine, the mundane documentation of human suffering cataloged in neat handwriting and filed away to be forgotten. But Walcott's journal was different. Chen had started reading it on a Tuesday afternoon, expecting another standard medical case study from the Victorian era. By Wednesday evening, he had called in sick to work so he could continue reading without interruption. By Friday morning, when he reached the final entries in Sarah's letter, he sat alone in his small apartment with his hands shaking and a terrible question burning in his mind. What if Sarah Ann Miller had survived? What if she had spent the last 124 years perfecting the methods she had begun developing as a 10-year-old girl in rural Missouri? What if she was still out there, moving from identity to identity, leaving a trail of carefully orchestrated deaths that appeared natural or accidental? Chen was not a superstitious man. He had a master's degree in library science and a minor in history. He understood that most historical mysteries remained mysteries because the evidence had been lost to time, not because of ongoing conspiracies. He knew that the rational explanation for Sarah's disappearance was death, from exposure, from violence, from any of the 100 dangers that could kill an unprotected child in 1874. But he also knew, with a certainty that defied rational explanation, that Sarah Ann Miller had not died in the woods outside Riverside Asylum. She had escaped, she had survived, and she had continued her work. The question was, where? Chen's investigation began with Dr. Walcott's later life, documented in the final sections of his journal. After leaving Riverside, Walcott had worked at 6 different institutions between 1874 and his death in 1891, asylums, poorhouses, and hospitals scattered across Missouri, Kansas, and Illinois. At each location, he had meticulously documented unusual deaths, unexplained accidents, and patients who displayed the emotional flatness that he had come to recognize as the hallmark of what Sarah had been. But Walcott had never found her. His journals from this period made increasingly desperate reading, a man spiraling into obsession and paranoia, seeing Sarah's influence in every suspicious death, suspecting every quiet, well-behaved female patient of being her in disguise. Chen cross-referenced Walcott's postings with historical records, looking for patterns that the doctor himself might have missed. What he found made his blood run cold. At 4 of the 6 institutions where Walcott had worked, there had been significant fires within 5 years of his arrival. Not during his tenure, Sarah was too careful for that, but shortly before or shortly after. In each case, the fires were ruled accidental. In each case, several people died. In each case, a young woman or girl went missing in the confusion and was presumed dead, but her body was never recovered. The pattern was consistent with Sarah's methodology at Riverside. Use fire to destroy evidence, use chaos to disappear, use missing, presumed dead status to avoid pursuit. But spread across multiple locations and many years, the pattern had been invisible to investigators at the time. Only someone looking at the complete picture, with Walcott's journal as a guide, could see the connection. Chen created a timeline. If Sarah had been 10 years old in 1874, she would have been 14 in 1878, 18 in 1882, 25 in 1889. At each age, in locations that corresponded with Walcott's employment, there had been a fire and a missing female matching that approximate age. She was reinventing herself regularly, Chen realized. Every few years she would orchestrate a fire or other disaster, disappear from her current identity, and resurface elsewhere with a new name and history. It was a pattern of serial reinvention that could potentially continue indefinitely, as long as she was careful never to stay in one place long enough to age suspiciously or draw sustained attention. The real breakthrough came when Chen expanded his search beyond Walcott's personal timeline. If Sarah had continued her pattern of regular reinvention after Walcott's death in 1891, there should be evidence of similar incidents stretching forward through the decades. He spent 3 months in archives across the Midwest, searching through newspaper records, fire investigation reports, and missing persons cases. The volume of data was overwhelming. Fires were common in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and people went missing constantly in an era before reliable identification systems. But Chen had a filter that earlier investigators had lacked. He was looking for fires or disasters where a female victim's body was never recovered, combined with unusual deaths in the months preceding the disaster. Deaths that would have appeared natural or accidental at the time, but showed signatures consistent with Sarah's known methods. Poisonings disguised as illness, falls from heights, apparent suicides of people with no prior history of mental distress. The pattern emerged slowly, like a photograph developing in chemical solution. Every 7 to 12 years, stretching from 1874 forward through the entire 20th century, there was an incident that fit the profile. The locations varied: small towns in the Midwest, larger cities on the coasts, even a few cases in Canada and Europe. But the methodology remained remarkably consistent. 1886. Fire at a boarding house in St. Louis. 3 dead. Missing victim. Mary Peterson, age 22, employed as a nurse. Several elderly patients in her care had died in the months before the fire, all from apparently natural causes. 1897. Factory fire in Chicago. 17 dead. Missing victim. Elizabeth Crane, age 28, worked in the factory office. 2 supervisors who had been harsh with workers had died in the months before. One from a fall downstairs, one from sudden illness attributed to bad meat. 1909. Hospital fire in Boston. 8 dead. Missing victim. Anna Schmidt, age 35, hospital administrator. 4 difficult patients had died in her ward over the previous year, all from complications of their existing illnesses. 1923. Tenement fire in New York. 12 dead. Missing victim. Catherine Moore, age 41, social worker. Several of her clients had died over the previous 2 years. Domestic accidents, apparent suicides, one poisoning from tainted food. 1938. Sanitarium fire in California. 6 dead. Missing victim. Dr. Helen Ashworth, age 50, staff physician. 3 patients and 1 nurse had died in the months before, all from causes that seemed unremarkable at the time. The pattern continued through the decades. Each iteration showed Sarah growing more sophisticated, choosing positions that gave her access to vulnerable populations while maintaining professional respectability. Nurse, administrator, doctor, social worker. Positions where deaths under her care would be expected, and where her medical knowledge would be seen as a credential rather than a weapon. And with each reinvention, she was aging normally, or at least appearing to age normally. By the 1990s, if Sarah had survived, she would be in her mid-130s, which was obviously impossible. Unless... Chen's next insight made him feel physically ill. What if Sarah had not been working alone all this time? What if she had identified others like herself, other individuals born without conscience or empathy, and taught them her methods? What if the pattern Chen was seeing was not one person moving through time, but a lineage of predators, each training the next before orchestrating their own disappearance? It would explain how the pattern could continue beyond a normal human lifespan. It would explain the slight variations in methodology across different incidents, different practitioners adapting Sarah's core techniques to their own circumstances. And it would mean that the threat was far larger than one individual. It would mean Sarah had created a tradition, a craft that could be passed down through generations. Chen's investigation took a darker turn when he found evidence that brought the pattern into the present day. The most recent incident that fit the profile had occurred just 2 years earlier, in 1996. A nursing home fire in Oregon. 9 elderly residents dead. 1 staff member missing, presumed dead though no body was recovered. Jennifer Walsh, age 34, registered nurse. In the 18 months before the fire, 12 residents under Walsh's care had died, a mortality rate that was elevated but not alarmingly so for a facility that specialized in hospice and end-of-life care. Chen obtained Jennifer Walsh's employment records through methods that were not entirely legal, but which he justified as necessary. Her resume was impeccable. Nursing degree from a well-regarded program, excellent references from previous employers, a warm and professional manner that patients and families loved. Her photograph showed an attractive woman with blonde hair and pale blue eyes. Chen stared at that photograph for a long time, comparing it mentally to Walcott's descriptions of Sarah. Of course, there was no way to confirm any physical resemblance across 122 years. But those pale blue eyes that stared out from the employee ID photo seemed to hold the same flat, empty quality that Walcott had described in his journals. He began investigating the deaths that had occurred under Walsh's care at the nursing home. Most were unremarkable, elderly people with terminal illnesses dying at predictable rates. But 3 cases stood out. A 78-year-old man who had been revising his will to disinherit his children in favor of a charity when he suddenly died of apparent heart failure. An 82-year-old woman who had been planning to report suspected financial abuse by the nursing home's administrator when she died from a fall in her room. a 71-year-old retired prosecutor who had recognized one of the other nurses as someone he had prosecuted decades earlier for fraud and had threatened to report her when he died from sudden respiratory failure. Each death had been ruled natural or accidental. Each had occurred at a moment that was extremely convenient for someone who needed those particular individuals to be silent. And each had occurred while Jennifer Walsh was on duty. Chen filed his findings with the Oregon State Police, along with copies of the relevant sections of Walcott's journal. He never received a formal response, but he did receive an unofficial phone call from a detective who told him, in carefully neutral language, that the case had been reviewed and closed. There was insufficient evidence to support any criminal investigation. The nursing home fire had been accidental. Jennifer Walsh was legally dead. The matter was resolved. The detective's tone suggested that he had been ordered to close the case by someone higher up the chain of command. Chen wondered if that someone had been influenced by Jennifer Walsh herself, or by whoever she had become after the fire. Chen's final discovery came almost by accident, while he was organizing his research materials for permanent archiving. He was reviewing photographs from the various fire scenes, looking for any detail he might have missed, when he noticed something that made his hands go numb. In the background of a photograph from the 1938 California sanitarium fire, barely visible in the crowd of evacuees and onlookers, was a young woman who matched the description of the missing Dr. Helen Ashworth. She was not running or crying or showing any signs of distress. She was standing perfectly still, watching the building burn, with what looked like a small traveling bag over her shoulder. In a photograph from the 1923 New York tenement fire, there was a similar figure, a woman matching Catherine Moore's description, standing apart from the chaos, watching the flames with clinical interest. In a photograph from the 1996 Oregon nursing home fire, taken by a local news photographer, there was a blonde woman in nurse's scrubs standing at the edge of the crowd. The photograph was slightly out of focus, and the woman's face was partially turned away from the camera, but her posture and that small traveling bag were identical to the figures in the earlier photographs. Sarah, or whoever had inherited her methods and her role, had been photographed watching her own fires. She had been unable to resist observing the results of her work, even when doing so created evidence of her survival. It was a pattern of behavior that Walcott had noted in his journal. Sarah's need to observe and document outcomes, her scientific curiosity overriding caution. Chen created a composite of the various photographs, attempting to identify common features that might have persisted across different identities. It was difficult. The images spanned different decades, different photographic technologies, different levels of image quality. But certain elements remained consistent. A particular way of standing, perfectly still while others moved frantically. A specific positioning relative to the fire, close enough to observe clearly, far enough to avoid being caught in rescue efforts. That small traveling bag, always over the left shoulder. And in the clearest photographs, pale eyes that seemed to watch the flames with the focus of a researcher observing a successful experiment. Chen prepared a comprehensive report documenting his findings, timeline, pattern analysis, photographic evidence, cross-reference death records. He sent copies to the FBI, to state police departments in every location where incidents had occurred, to academic researchers who specialized in serial murder and criminal psychology. The response was underwhelming. Most agencies never replied. Those that did sent polite form letters acknowledging receipt of his materials, but explaining that without more concrete evidence linking the various incidents, no investigation could be launched. Several respondents suggested, with varying degrees of tact, that Chen had fallen victim to pattern recognition bias, seeing connections where none existed, constructing elaborate theories from coincidental data. One response stood out. It came from a retired FBI profiler named Dr. Margaret Torres, who had specialized in unusual serial offenders during her 30-year career. Her letter was brief, but troubling. Mr. Chen, I read your report with great interest. You are not the first person to identify this pattern. Over my career, I received similar reports from at least 4 other researchers, each working independently, each identifying essentially the same sequence of fires and missing women stretching back into the 19th century. Each researcher compiled compelling evidence. Each submitted it to law enforcement, and each was politely dismissed. I investigated several of these incidents myself during the 1980s and early 1990s. I came to believe that you are correct. There is a pattern, and it represents something genuinely dangerous. But I was never able to develop evidence strong enough to support prosecution or even official investigation. The problem is this. If the person or people behind these incidents have been operating successfully for over a century, they have become extraordinarily skilled at avoiding detection. Every death appears natural or accidental when examined individually. Every fire seems to have plausible causes. Every disappearance can be explained by the chaos of the disaster. The pattern only becomes visible when you step back and look at the complete picture across decades. And by then, the individual pieces of evidence are too old, too scattered, and too circumstantial to support action. I am now retired and cannot pursue this matter further. But I want you to know that I believe you are correct, and I want you to be extremely careful. Of the 4 previous researchers who investigated this pattern, 3 died within 5 years of publishing their findings. 2 were ruled suicides. 1 was a house fire. All 3 were living alone at the time of their deaths. All 3 had made their research publicly available before they died. I suggest you keep your findings private, store copies in multiple secure locations, and watch for anyone who takes an unusual interest in your work. Stay safe, Dr. Margaret Torres. Chen read the letter 3 times, then immediately made multiple copies of all his research and distributed them to colleagues, friends, and secure storage facilities. He set up a system where if he failed to check in weekly, the materials would be automatically released to media organizations and law enforcement agencies simultaneously. He knew it was probably paranoid. He knew that Dr. Torres might have been exaggerating, seeing patterns in deaths that were genuinely coincidental. But he also knew what he had read in Walcott's journal. Sarah's level of sophistication even as a child, her ability to plan years ahead, her willingness to eliminate anyone who posed a threat to her work. If she or her successors were still operating, they would see Chen's investigation as a threat, and they would respond accordingly. 6 months after Chen received Dr. Torres's letter, his apartment building caught fire. It started at 2:30 a.m. on a Wednesday in June 1999. Chen was awakened by smoke detectors and the smell of burning. He grabbed his research bag. He had started sleeping with it beside his bed and made it out of the building with minor smoke inhalation. 17 other residents escaped safely. No one died. The fire investigation determined that the blaze had started in the building's basement, in an area where maintenance supplies were stored. The probable cause was spontaneous combustion of oil-soaked rags that had been improperly stored. It was ruled accidental. But Chen noticed several details that the official investigation had not emphasized. The fire had started directly below his apartment, in a section of the basement that was normally locked and accessible only to maintenance staff. The smoke detector in his apartment had been replaced 3 days before the fire by someone claiming to be from the building management company. The company had no record of ordering that maintenance. The new smoke detector had worked perfectly, perhaps too perfectly. It had awakened him immediately, giving him time to escape, but also ensuring he would grab his research bag and evacuate quickly, making it impossible to save other materials in his apartment. And in the crowd of evacuees and onlookers gathered outside the building, Chen saw a woman standing slightly apart from the others. She was middle-aged, blonde, professionally dressed despite the early hour. She stood perfectly still while others moved and talked frantically. She held a small bag over her left shoulder, and when their eyes met across the crowd, she smiled. A small, knowing smile, before turning and walking away into the darkness. Chen tried to follow her, but by the time he pushed through the crowd, she had disappeared. He reported the sighting to police, but without a clearer description or any evidence that she had been involved in the fire, there was nothing they could do. 3 weeks later, Chen received a package at his office. It contained no return address, no note, no explanation. Inside was a single item, a photocopy of a page from what appeared to be a much older journal, written in faded ink on yellowed paper. The handwriting was neat, precise, and immediately familiar. It was the same script he had seen in Sarah Ann Miller's research documents from 1874. The page contained a brief entry. Observation, June 1999. Subject R. Chen, archivist, age 41. Subject identified historical pattern through examination of Dr. Walcott's journal. Subject compiled comprehensive evidence and distributed it to multiple recipients. Subject demonstrated intelligence, thoroughness, and admirable caution in protecting his research. Intervention. Controlled fire in subject's residence, designed to appear accidental while eliminating physical research materials. Subject's evacuation ensured through properly functioning smoke alarm. Subject's digital materials presumably backed up. Acceptable risk, as pattern of dismissal by authorities already well established. Outcome. Subject survives with minor injuries and increased paranoia. Research materials partially destroyed, but subject's credibility as investigator likely damaged by proximity to fire matching his own documented pattern. If subject continues investigation, subsequent researchers will note that he too was victim of suspicious fire, reinforcing Dr. Torres's warning and potentially discouraging future investigation. Additional outcome. Subject now aware that he is being observed. This awareness will consume significant psychological resources, reduce effectiveness of any future investigation, and serve as warning to others who might consider similar research. Subject permitted to survive because living witness who appears paranoid and unreliable is more useful than dead martyr whose work might inspire others. Conclusion. Satisfactory management of potential threat. Situation continues to be monitored. Note. Subject's observation skills are genuinely impressive. He came closer to accurate reconstruction of operational pattern than any previous investigator except Dr. Walcott himself. Under different circumstances, he might have made an excellent student. However, ethical framework too rigid for practical instruction. Regrettable but necessary to maintain distance and restrict to observation only. SAM, June 1999. The initials at the bottom could have meant anything, but Chen knew with absolute certainty what they represented. Sarah Ann Miller was still alive, or someone who had taken that name and that role was still alive, and she was watching him. Chen made two decisions in the aftermath of receiving that page. First, he would stop actively investigating. He would maintain his backup systems and his distributed copies of research materials, but he would not pursue new leads or attempt to identify current iterations of the pattern. Sarah, or whoever she was, had made her position clear. He was being permitted to live as long as he did not become a serious threat. Continuing to investigate would change that calculation. Second, he would ensure that his research materials remained accessible to future investigators. He could not stop Sarah, but perhaps someone else, someday, would be able to complete what he had started. He created a comprehensive archive, properly organized and documented, and arranged for it to be deposited in multiple research libraries with instructions that it should be made available to serious scholars upon request. Among those materials was Dr. Walcott's original journal, along with Chen's own extensive notes and analysis. Anyone who read them would understand the pattern. Anyone who looked carefully would see that the pattern had not ended. And anyone who chose to investigate further would at least know what they were facing. Chen lived another 27 years after that night, dying peacefully in 2026 from complications of age-related illness. He never resumed his investigation of Sarah Ann Miller. He never again saw the blonde woman with the pale eyes and the small traveling bag. But he never stopped watching for her. And he never forgot the final line of her message to him, written in that neat, precise script that had not changed in 125 years. I will always be exactly what I am. The archive that Robert Chen created remains accessible to researchers today. It sits in climate-controlled storage facilities at 3 separate universities, properly cataloged and available for examination by qualified scholars. Very few people have requested access to it. Those who have often report finding the materials disturbing, the pattern too elaborate to be believable, the connections too tenuous to support serious investigation. Most conclude that Chen, like Walcott before him, had fallen victim to obsessive pattern recognition, seeing connections where none truly existed. But occasionally, a researcher examines the materials and comes to a different conclusion. They see what Walcott saw, what Chen saw, what Dr. Torres saw. They recognize the pattern stretching across more than a century of carefully orchestrated deaths and disappearances. Some of these researchers publish their findings, adding new evidence and extending the timeline forward into the 21st century. Some report their discoveries to law enforcement, hoping that modern forensic techniques and databases might finally provide the evidence needed to stop the pattern. And some simply close the archive boxes, return them to storage, and walk away, understanding that certain predators have evolved defenses that make them effectively impossible to stop. The pattern continues. Every 7 to 12 years there is an incident, a fire, a building collapse, some disaster that claims multiple lives and leaves one body unrecovered. In the months before each incident, there are deaths that seem unremarkable individually, but form a troubling pattern when examined collectively. The names change, the locations vary, the specifics of each incident differ, but the underlying signature remains consistent for those who know how to recognize it. Somewhere in the world, in a hospital or nursing home or hospice facility, there is likely a competent professional woman with excellent credentials and warm references. Her patients love her. Her colleagues respect her. Her superiors value her dedication and skill. She is probably blonde, though hair color can be changed. She probably has pale blue eyes, though colored contacts can hide that. She probably carries a small bag with essential documents and resources, always ready to disappear if circumstances require it. And somewhere in her possession, carefully protected and regularly updated, there is probably a journal. Not as detailed as the records she kept as a child. She has learned caution over the decades, but enough to document her experiments, record her observations, and track the evolution of her methods across more than a century of practice. She might be in her 60s now, approaching retirement age, preparing for another reinvention. Or she might have already completed that transition, emerging somewhere with a new identity and a new set of vulnerable populations to study. Or she might have identified a successor, someone born with the same absence of conscience and empathy, and taught them everything she learned from Dr. Walcott and from 125 years of careful experimentation. The craft that Sarah Ann Miller developed as a 10-year-old child in rural Missouri might now be practiced by multiple individuals, each operating independently, each contributing to a pattern that has become too large and too diffuse for any single investigation to encompass. We do not know. We cannot know. That is the terrible genius of Sarah's methodology. By destroying evidence, by changing identities, by making each death appear natural or accidental when examined individually, she created a predatory practice that is effectively invisible unless you step back far enough to see the full pattern. And by the time you see the full pattern, the individual pieces of evidence are too old and too scattered to support action. Dr. Walcott understood this in 1874, when he wrote his final journal entry asking whether Sarah was still out there. Robert Chen understood it in 1999, when he chose to stop investigating rather than become her next victim. Anyone who reads their archived materials carefully will come to understand it as well. The question is not whether the pattern exists. The evidence for that is overwhelming, for those willing to examine it objectively. The question is whether anyone can stop it, and the answer, based on 150 years of failed attempts, appears to be no. Sarah Ann Miller, or whatever she has chosen to call herself, made a promise in her final letter to Dr. Walcott. She said she would always be exactly what she was. She has kept that promise. And somewhere tonight, in a quiet room in a facility where vulnerable people are cared for by trusted professionals, she is probably still keeping it. Still watching, still learning, still perfecting her terrible craft, still hungry. Epilogue. If you are reading this, you have reached the end of Dr. Isaac Walcott's case study, as preserved and extended by Robert Chen and subsequent researchers. You now know what they knew. You have seen the pattern that they documented. You may choose to investigate further. The archived materials are available. The pattern continues to generate new data points. Perhaps you will be the one who finally develops evidence strong enough to stop what Sarah began. Or you may choose to close this file, return it to storage, and walk away with the knowledge that some forms of evil are too sophisticated, too patient, and too careful to be stopped by conventional means. Either choice is understandable. But before you decide, consider one final detail. If you do choose to investigate further, if you do compile new evidence and publish your findings, you will be adding your name to a list of researchers who have studied this pattern. And that list is itself part of the pattern. 3 of the 4 researchers who investigated before Robert Chen died under circumstances that appeared natural or accidental. Chen himself survived, but only by abandoning his investigation after receiving a direct warning. The question you must ask yourself is this: if you continue this investigation, if you come close to identifying Sarah's current identity, will you join the list of researchers who died? Or will you be allowed to survive, like Chen, as a warning to others? And more troubling still, how will you know which category you fall into until it is too late? Think carefully before you proceed. Sarah Ann Miller has had 150 years to perfect her methods, and she is very, very good at what she does. You've reached the end of Sarah Ann Miller's story, or at least the end of what we know. Dr. Walcott died in 1891, still searching for her. Robert Chen stopped investigating in 1999 after a fire destroyed his apartment and he received a message signed SAM. He chose survival over answers. The pattern of fires and missing women continues to this day. Different names, different locations, but always the same signature. Somewhere tonight, Sarah Ann Miller, or whoever has inherited her methods, may still be watching, still learning, still perfecting her terrible craft. Or perhaps she died as a child in 1874, and we're simply seeing patterns where none exist. We may never know the truth. If this story gave you chills, hit that like button and subscribe for more dark historical mysteries. Drop a comment below. What do you think happened to Sarah? Do you believe she's still out there?